It does break my heart that if you're sharing you had an abortion, that there could be a child, I don't know how old they'd be, 10 years old today, who would be cheering you on saying, go get it, mom, you got this.
If you already have children, which is the majority of people who seek out abortions, and you're worried about poverty, which is valid, and you're seeing your children not be able to eat, these are not just fears. These are valid concerns that cause people to say, you know what, I don't want to bring a baby into this inhospitable place where I might die.
Abortion leaves women scarred for life.
There has been a not so subtle dehumanization movement over the last 60 years that makes it acceptable to crush human beings smaller than you if you so choose.
And so by not allowing women to an abortion, you're basically saying you have to have this permanent being that exists in this world. Abortion is not an easy choice for women.
Just because it's inside of you doesn't give you the right to terminate it.
But is it your right to make the decision for me?
It is a basic human right to have an abortion, to have a choice.
Abortion hurts women! You're not speaking from the Bible, you're speaking from opinion.
Not a church, not a state, really must decide their fate.
After making a lot of enemies talking about the morality of killing animals for food, I'm going to try to make even more talking about abortion. Or this is probably what I would have said if I had like millions of views, but I only have 100, so I don't have any enemies anyways. The abortion debate is probably even more tense than the vegan one, because in contrast to it, here the two camps really think that the other one is guilty of acts that are morally repugnant. Indeed, at least in the vegan debates, meat eaters don't actually think that vegans are immoral. They just think that at most they are stupid and doing things that don't make any sense, but certainly not things that are immoral. Here, the choice is much riskier, because by choosing one camp, you might either deny the rights of women or the right of fetuses. Even if I think that this would be a poor way of thinking, you could always be a vegetarian or a vegan just by default, because in the worst case, you're not doing anything wrong. But here, concerning abortion, you are bound to pick a moral stance. There is no safe place. You have to choose your side, so you better get started thinking about it. 1. Can I, as a man, talk about this issue? So yes, I know that I'm a man and I'm talking about abortion, while I'm never going to be a woman and never going to be a fetus again. So I acknowledge that it will always be impossible for me to really put myself in the position of either camps. Yet, I already talked about animal rights without being one, so let's get started. More seriously, I'm convinced that anyone should be able to talk about any moral subject, even if it doesn't concern him or her. For example, I'm allowed to take a stance on the Ukrainian-Russian war even if I'm not Ukrainian or Russian and have nothing to do with this conflict. I'm even allowed to want sanctions for one belligerent. If you think that an injustice exists, you should be able to speak out, even if it doesn't concern you. And people are able to respond, and this is how we create a debate of ideas that is constructive. 2. Are we talking about legislation? So before starting the argumentation, I want to say that I'm not interested in the legal aspect of abortion, at least not in this video. Indeed, bringing legality to this debate just brings more complexity, because you have to take into account the societal impact of making such laws illegal, as well as the public acceptance of it. So let's keep it to the individual aspect of morality. More precisely, let's imagine we take the case of a woman or a couple who's considering abortion in a case where it's legal. She or they want to balance their personal interest with the moral aspect of aborting. Therefore, before anyone mentions it, the argument of bodily autonomy doesn't apply here, because we're already putting ourselves in a context where it's legal and where the choice is made by the person and not by a law that is above her. So, what is the harm done to the two camps in this debate? 3. Is the embryo alive and conscious? So when there is an abortion, it's quite clear. The harm done to the embryo or the fetus is that it's killed. This fact can't really be debated. I've heard the argument that the embryo isn't really alive when the abortion is performed, but this doesn't really make sense biologically speaking. Life is starting by the fertilization of the egg by the sperm cell. Indeed, when the sperm cell fertilizes the egg, forming a zygote, a new genetic code is created by combining the DNA of both parents. This genetic code will remain the same throughout your whole life up to a few mutations. When fertilization happens, an individuated, zygotic living human organism, a member of the Homo sapiens species, is created. If you think that maybe birth defines life, it wouldn't make sense. Indeed, the fetus inside the womb can be alive or dead. Gynecologists know that. The physical transfer from inside the womb to outside the womb doesn't change anything biologically speaking, and the fetus remains alive. So it is irrelevant to the question of whether or not the fetus is alive. If you have any other definition of when life starts, I'm curious to hear about it. But now wait, the argumentation is not finished. It's not because we established that abortion is effectively killing an embryo that it is morally unacceptable, or that it is as morally unacceptable as killing a fully grown human being. Two members of the same species don't necessarily have the same equal moral worth. For example, if you had to choose to kill between two persons, one in a coma and one not in a coma, I guess that everybody would say to kill the person in the coma. This is because even if it sounds very harsh to hear, we do have different moral worth for different people. And in addition to that, the morality of an act doesn't only depend on the consequences. Here, the fact that the embryo is killed. It also depends on the constraints put upon you. In, I think, all modern countries, you have the concept of legitimate defense, meaning that if someone assaults you, you are allowed to kill him if he was a real threat. So the morality of killing is really context dependent, and we cannot say that killing someone has always the same moral weight. So when it comes to ethics, suffering is one of the main components when deciding to judge an action. Nevertheless, it's not the only one, as we saw in the vegetarian video, and don't worry, I'll come back to it. So, does the embryo suffer when an abortion is performed? So, as you might guess, this is highly dependent on when the abortion happens. From the data I could collect, no suffering seems to be involved in the first 3 months of pregnancy, where the high majority of abortions are performed. More than this, the embryo or fetus shouldn't even be conscious before 20 weeks. Although we always need to be careful when talking about consciousness and assessing whether an agent really feels something. If you're interested, this is linked to the problem of other minds in the philosophy of consciousness, namely the fact that we can only know our own consciousness, but we'll never be able to know the consciousness of other people. We can infer it from the fact that other people have same reactions as we have, for example, when we hit them, but we really won't ever be sure of what they are consciously feeling, especially if they cannot communicate it, like in the case of fetuses. We can also consider the fact that the embryo has movements of fighting back when an abortion is performed at 3 months old, but this is mostly considered reflexes, as a person in the coma might have some reflexes if you sting it, even if he's not conscious of it. I want to add to finish this section that consciousness is really more of a spectrum than an on-off switch. And even a fully born baby doesn't have the same consciousness as you and me have. So, to sum up, we can fairly say that when an abortion is performed, the embryo is alive, so this act indeed constitutes killing. However, it is very unlikely that the embryo is conscious or capable of feeling pain. 4. Other considerations concerning the embryo. So now, as I said previously, when it comes to morality, we cannot only care for suffering or for consciousness. So if you haven't seen my video on vegetarianism, let me give you an example that illustrates this point. So imagine that I would go out at night and I see a homeless person. Now this homeless person is so drunk that he actually isn't conscious, and I decide to take him while he remains unconscious. Back to my place, I inject him an anesthesia and then medically kill him. In the whole process, the homeless person didn't suffer anything or didn't even have any consciousness of what happened to him. Furthermore, let's imagine that really nobody knew this person, and so nobody will suffer the pain of seeing him gone. We can quite confidently say that in the whole process there was literally zero suffering involved. Yet our intuition screams at us that this act is deeply immoral. Killing someone without his will is simply evil, even if no suffering is involved whatsoever. Okay, so there is something else to take into account than suffering. But what? In the previous video I talked about two possibilities: the inherent value of life and the deprivation of future years to live. I personally give more importance to the latter because it's a much more flexible notion and we all grasp why we have an interest in living longer. Indeed, based on simple natural selection processes, we know that each living being has an interest in continuing his life. So for me, this is the answer of the original question of what is the harm done to the embryo or the fetus. It's not about suffering, but it's mainly about depriving it or him of future years to live. Just like the homeless guy in my thought experiment. So the million-dollar question now is, how much do these future years weight morally speaking? Well, this is a very hard question and there is no absolute answer. But let's just say that, at least for me, it's not nothing. The embryo has the potential of growing into a human being just like you and me and having wonderful years to live, possibly. So to be clear, I would still value more a born baby than a fetus. But I think in the same way that I would still value more a 6-year-old kid than a newborn baby. That being said, it's all very subjective and I'll leave it to you to exactly determine your position on the matter. 5. Constraints of having a child. So now let's imagine that on the contrary, there was no abortion, so a baby was born. What here are the harms done to the mother or the couple and to the kid? Well, having a baby imposes a lot of constraints, both physical and emotional. Let's try to list just a few of them, non-exhaustively of course. So first, concerning physical harm, pregnancies can induce several problems, but let's just show two of them for the example. Gestational diabetes and preeclampsia. For people who, like me before this video, have no idea what these terms mean, let me explain. Basically, gestational diabetes is characterized by elevated glucose level. Preeclampsia is a pregnancy complication marked by high blood pressures and damage to the organs, often the kidney. Symptoms may include severe headaches, swelling, and upper abdominal pain. According to this study, preeclampsia occurs in 4.6% of pregnancies and gestational diabetes in 13.4%. Women can also experience long-term health impacts such as pelvic floor disorders or chronic pain. Childbirth in itself isn't also without complication as it can induce postpartum hemorrhage as well as recovery from C-section. Finally, the recovery can induce long-term changes to the body like weight gain, scars, or hormonal imbalances. Bottom line, pregnancy is no easy job. Just keep in mind that these problems have to be put into perspective with the fact that abortion, especially if it's surgical, can also induce some physical harm. Now, having a child also induces emotional and psychological constraints, both during and after pregnancy. Indeed, sleep deprivation alone can exacerbate stress and emotional instability, without even speaking about the child itself that can really be a source of stress. There is also, of course, the loss of personal freedom due to the fact that you have to care about the child. The last weights that I can think of are probably the financial one and the time-related one. By having a child, you will need to provide him for everything until he's at least 18. This can include food, housing, education, and emotional support. Now, thank God, having a child is not only about constraints, and it can really be a fulfilling experience for the parents. Indeed, there are lots of joyful moments. Most people who have children say that despite all the difficulties, the children are a great source of happiness for them. I think that it's no coincidence that parents often keep a picture of their children in their wallets, or more recently, they have them as their home screen. But what about the baby? What are the harms done to the baby if he's being born? In the last section, I described the deprivation of future years to live, but this was a bit too simplistic. Indeed, not all lives are equal and not all lives will have the same amount of suffering and joy. I personally think that as long as the life is not mainly about suffering, then it's a life worth living. But this is, again, very subjective. And finally, all what I just said for the harms done to the mother, the couple, or the baby are highly dependent on the situation. A couple living in a Western developed country with access to education, welfare, and more importantly, a supportive family will have much less constraint than a single mom living in a developed country. And I'm not talking about the case of rape, which is orders of magnitude more serious in terms of harm. 6. Who is responsible? In this section, I really want to emphasize on the fact that I'm against shaming anyone. I really think that this is counterproductive and there is no need to add psychological constraints. The choice is already hard enough. Reasons for aborting or not are numerous and I'm not here to judge. A second thing that I want to emphasize is about the responsibility of the father. We almost only talk about the woman when it comes to an abortion. And this is fair because she is the one who will carry the child and have all the constraints of pregnancies. And also, she will most likely be the one who has to take care of the child, as even if mentalities are evolving, it is still quite often the woman who takes care of all of the household duties concerning the children. Yet, this doesn't mean that the father shouldn't be considered at all concerning abortion. It takes two people to produce a child, so when I talk about the harm done to the embryo, the responsibility is as much on the father as it is on the mother. For example, when the father is absent and just leaves the mom with her pregnancy, he is highly responsible for putting these constraints on her. And if, in the end, the woman chooses to have an abortion, he will be responsible for having put the constraints that made her do this choice. It's really important for me to stress this point out. The father is as responsible as the mother concerning abortion. So, just to resume these 2 points, I'm against the shaming of anyone, but it doesn't mean that I'm against responsibility. And concerning these points, I think that the father has as much of it as the mother has. 7. Recap and conclusion. So now let's sum up everything that we've said in a table for our hypothetical woman or couple to be able to balance out the personal interest with the morality concerning aborting or not. So, when there is an abortion, the moral problem is that the embryo is deprived of future years to live. When the decision is to keep the child, on the one hand, there will be some physical, emotional, financial, and time-related pressures on the mother and the couple. On the other hand, she or they will have the joy of raising a child, which can be a very fulfilling experience, of course, depending on conditions. Concerning the child, his life can range from horrible to a quite meaningful one, comprised of joys and disappointments, just like everybody else. This life has to be put in comparison to him or her not having lived at all. Now, precisely weighting all of the constraints above is already a hard task to do, but adding the deprivation of future years to live can seem like even harder. At the end of the day, it's a very personal decision to take, and I'll leave it up to you. So, I still wanted to make this video for a few reasons. The first one is that I think in this debate, most people focus on the legal aspect, but the main question is really a moral one. Second of all, this debate is often very polarized, and we don't usually see it in terms of a balance like I try to do. Usually I hear either that the life of the baby is the supreme value that just cannot be outweighed by anything, or that the fetus doesn't have any moral worth and is not to take into consideration. Both positions are simplistic to me, and I think that putting things in a balance, like I try to do, is a much more responsible thing to do, morally speaking. So now, on a personal note, I used to think that the baby didn't have any moral worth, and that the question of aborting was really a question of convenience and not of morality. I'm relieved that I've never faced such a hard decision, because I definitely wasn't harmed to tackle this not so long ago. Therefore, I dedicate this video to the Jeff from 5 years ago. We are now reaching the end of this video, and congratulations if you've made it so far. Making the script for this video was really hard, and I think that actually my thought process even evolved in the producing of it. I know that I didn't cover every subject concerning abortion, and maybe this will come up in future videos, but let me know what you thought were the weakest point of my argumentation and potentially fallacies in my reasoning. I'm sure there are many, so please comment what's your opinion on the subject. As always, continue growing your wisdom, and until then, see you next time.